Have you ever wondered if Adam and Eve were really the first humans? Or is there a possibility that others walked the earth before them? For centuries, this question has intrigued theologians, scientists, and truth seekers alike. In this video, we're diving deep into ancient texts, scientific discoveries, and biblical mysteries to explore the possibility of human existence before Adam and Eve. Prepare yourself. What you're about to discover may challenge everything you thought you knew about the origin of mankind. The traditional biblical view. According to the traditional biblical account, Adam and Eve were the first human beings created by God. Genesis 1 and 2 lay the foundation of this belief, portraying a divine act of creation. Adam was formed from the dust of the earth, and Eve from Adam's rib. Together, they lived in the Garden of Eden and were commanded to care for it. This interpretation is the cornerstone of Judeo-Christian anthropology. For thousands of years, it has shaped how believers understand sin, salvation, and humanity's place in creation. In Genesis 1 verses 26 to 27, God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Verse 27 follows, "So God created man in his own image, male and female he created them." Then, in Genesis 2, the narrative narrows in on Adam and Eve specifically, often interpreted as the first individual humans. But here's where things get interesting. Many scholars and readers have noticed that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 seem to offer two slightly different creation accounts. Genesis 1 gives a cosmic overview, while Genesis 2 zooms in on Eden and Adam. This discrepancy has led some to ask, were Adam and Eve the first humans ever, or simply the first humans in a special relationship with God? The scientific perspective. Science tells a different story. Based on evolutionary biology and fossil evidence, modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed for about 200,000 to 300,000 years. This conclusion is drawn from fossil records, genetic studies, and radiometric dating. The earliest remains of Homo sapiens were discovered in East Africa. Over time, humans migrated across continents, developed languages, formed societies, and built civilizations. In contrast, most biblical scholars place Adam and Eve somewhere between 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. This timeline doesn't line up with archaeological and genetic data. So how do we reconcile these views? Some argue that Adam and Eve were not the first biological humans, but rather the first spiritual humans, the first people with a conscious relationship with God. This interpretation attempts to bridge the gap between science and scripture. Others suggest the Genesis story is a theological narrative, not meant to be taken as a literal historical account, but rather a symbolic story about the human condition. In this view, the Genesis account isn't denying the existence of other humans. It's just telling the story of one particular family, the one that matters for the biblical narrative. Clues from the Bible itself. Believe it or not, there are subtle clues in the Bible that seem to imply the existence of other humans during or even before Adam and Eve's time. Let's take a look at Genesis 4. After Cain kills Abel, he's banished by God. Cain fears for his life and says in verse 14, "Whoever finds me will kill me." But wait, who is whoever? If only Adam, Eve, and Cain were alive at the time, who else could there be? Then in Genesis 4:17 we're told that Cain knew his wife. But where did she come from? The text doesn't say Adam and Eve had a daughter before this moment. Some traditions try to fill in the blanks by suggesting Adam and Eve had many unnamed children, but the text itself is silent. Cain then goes on to build a city, called Enoch after his son. But how do you build a city without a population? These verses have raised eyebrows for generations. One theory is that there were other human beings, either created by God separately or evolved through natural means, living outside the Adamic narrative. Adam and Eve's story, then, would be one of covenant, not chronology. Ancient Near Eastern context. To understand Genesis more fully, we need to look at its cultural context. The ancient Near East was home to a number of creation stories, Sumerian, Babylonian, and Egyptian, to name a few. One example is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the Bible and features a garden, a serpent, and a flood. These similarities suggest the biblical authors were writing within a broader cultural conversation. In many of these myths, humanity already exists in large numbers, and the gods interact with them selectively. Could Genesis be doing the same? Rather than describing the first humans ever, perhaps Genesis is telling the story of the first humans chosen for a divine relationship. The Garden of Eden would then represent sacred space, a temple of sorts, where Adam and Eve served as priests. Outside the garden, there may have been many people, but none with the covenantal role Adam and Eve held. Theological implications. If humans existed before or outside of Adam and Eve, what does that mean for Christian theology? One major concern is the doctrine of original sin. Romans 5:12 says, "Sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin." If Adam wasn't the first human, how could he be the source of sin? Some theologians answer this by emphasizing federal headship. Adam wasn't necessarily the first human, but he was the representative of humanity in God's covenant. Just as Christ is the new Adam, redeeming all, so the first Adam represented all, even if others were alive at the time. Another consideration is the nature of Scripture itself. If Genesis is not literal history but theological narrative, then it doesn't have to conflict with science. Its message remains intact, that humans are created in God's image, that we fall short, and that God seeks to restore us. Understanding Adam and Eve symbolically or covenantally doesn't undermine the gospel. It might even enrich it. The pre-Adamic human theory. Now let's dig into the controversial theory of pre-Adamic humans. This idea isn't new. In fact, it gained traction in the 17th and 18th centuries among both religious and scientific thinkers. The theory holds that humans or human-like beings existed before the biblical Adam. These beings were biologically similar to us, but spiritually distinct. Some tied pre-Adamic humans to fossils and ancient remains discovered in Europe and Africa. Others speculated these beings were soulless, animal-like in mind but human in form. Still others believed the Pre-Adamites were fully human, and that Adam and Eve were simply the first chosen humans. In modern times, some theologians, like William Lane Craig, have explored the idea of mytho-history, suggesting that the Genesis story blends symbolic narrative with historical echoes. Craig and others suggest Adam and Eve were historical figures within a larger human population. This helps explain genetic diversity in human DNA and aligns with the archaeological record, Counterarguments and Criticisms. Of course, not everyone agrees with the pre-Adamic theory. Traditionalists argue that the Bible is clear. Adam was the first man, and Eve the first woman. To say otherwise, they warn, undermines the authority of Scripture. They also point to genealogies, like those in 1 Chronicles and Luke, which trace Jesus' lineage all the way back to Adam. To them, this confirms Adam as the origin point. Others worry about the theological cost. If sin didn't enter through Adam, does the gospel still make sense? And yet, Even some conservative scholars admit that the Genesis text allows for ambiguity. The Bible never explicitly says Adam and Eve were the only people created. It only says they were the first to walk with God in Eden. A balanced view. So what's the takeaway? There are three main ways people interpret the question of humans before Adam and Eve. Literalist view: Adam and Eve were the first and only humans created by God. Theological view: Adam and Eve were the first to have a covenant relationship with God, but not the only humans alive. Mytho-Historical view: Adam and Eve are symbolic representations of early humanity, not individuals in a literal sense. Each view has strengths and weaknesses. The literalist view preserves traditional doctrines but conflicts with scientific data. The theological view aligns with both scripture and science, but requires reinterpreting Genesis. The mytho-historical view offers poetic depth, but may challenge literal readings. Ultimately, your conclusion depends on how you understand the Bible, literally, theologically, or both. Final thoughts. So, were there humans before Adam and Eve? Science says yes. Some biblical interpretations say maybe, and tradition says no. The truth might lie somewhere in between. Perhaps Adam and Eve were real people, chosen by God in a world already populated by humans. Or maybe they're literary figures, telling a story deeper than history, one about identity, purpose, and divine love. In any case, the Genesis narrative remains a powerful cornerstone of faith, inviting us to reflect not just on where we come from, but where we're going. And that might be the most important truth of all. Call to action. What do you think? Are you Team Literal Adam, Team Theological Humanity, or Team Let's Keep Digging? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If this video gave you something to think about, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Stay curious and keep seeking truth.